So you've asked me about John the Cross and what he means to me personally, but also what he can say to our formation program. John's always been somewhat of a mystery for me. I probably don't know that much about him. I certainly wouldn't want to give a talk to the lay Carmelites on John the Cross, but I've always looked to him for some of the answers with regards to love, because some of his poetry, some of his writings truly indicate that he knew what it was like. I believe he knew what it was like to be in love, and he translated that love that he experienced to the experience of loving God and loving neighbor and falling in love with God. Recently in community at St. Cyril Priory, we joined the San Angelo community in reflecting on this theme of love with regards to an article from Psychology Today by Robert Trotter. It was an article about love, and he related love to a triangle, that there's three sides to love. And one was commitment, the second was intimacy, and the third was passion. And I think that for our formation program, I think it's very important for everybody in formation to understand the idea of commitment, intimacy, and passion. You know, where is your passion? And is your passion partly for prayer, for ministry, for community? And trying to find that balance is important. Where's your commitment? And the commitment not only to the Carmelites, commitment to God, and where are we finding intimacy? Because oftentimes when people go off the track of where intimacy can be found, that's where we get ourselves into trouble. I think we've got to find healthy ways to experience intimacy in communion and in community, and recognizing that intimacy is a need for all of us. So I think in many ways John of the Cross, as a Carmelite and as people in Carmelite formation, can help inform us on the ways in which we can see commitment, intimacy, and passion. And so I think that reading some of his writings and recognizing that these are human struggles that we have with each one of those things, commitment, intimacy, and passion, and recognizing somehow that how he writes and what he says can help us balance these things in our life and recognize how they help us relate to God and ultimately also relate to one another. So I think that's part of what I would like to say about how John of the Cross can help us be informed with regards to our formation program, and also a little bit of what he means to me.
Who is St. John of the Cross for me? And I would guess I would have to be honest that I prefer his big sister, St. Teresa of Jesus, a little more. However, I have been influenced and have enjoyed getting to know St. John of the Cross. Some years ago, in 1992, I attended the Council of Provinces, which was held in Salamanca in Spain. As part of that Council of the Provinces meeting, we had the opportunity to go into depth in the music and the poetry and the works of St. John of the Cross, and also to visit where he was born in Fontiveros in Spain, and to be where he is buried in Segovia, also in Spain. And it was very impressive and a very kind of spiritual experience for me, because St. John of the Cross was born in a very humble place, and you could see the starkness of the place, and you could see the countryside of Castile and begin to understand something of the culture out of which St. John of the Cross grew. Fontiveros, a very small town, and our Carmelite nuns have a monastery there. Later on, I did some reading in St. John of the Cross, reading of his work and reading about him. And I did some of that reading in preparation to give classes to the Carmelite sisters novices in Avila. And I guess in my reading I came to understand that the impression that St. John of the Cross gives at first of being somewhat severe really betrays the fact that he was a very warm human being, very devoted to his confreres in the Carmelite life, very devoted to his mother and to his brothers, one of whom, of course, died young. But when he did begin the reform, he brought his brother with him. and his brother helped to care for the friars. And I wondered, how could he reconcile the idea of nada, 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 nothing to be preferred or to God, and nothing to block us and nothing to stop us? How could he reconcile that with the deep love that he had for his family and for the many nuns that he was the spiritual director of? I wondered, how would those nuns ever be attracted to a cold man? But in fact, he wasn't a cold man. He used every one of his human gifts in order to help the sisters and the lay people that he directed to get closer to God, and that there was plenty of love in his heart for other people. But nothing was as important as the love that we must have, that he had for God. And so when I read that nada, nada, I read that as the baseline, that yes, I can love all kinds of people, I can be involved in all kinds of projects, but nothing must be equal to what I reserve in my heart and soul for God. I think that for those who are in formation, the fact that St. John of the Cross struggled in his own vocation to find the right place for himself is a great encouragement. How he wanted to go flee to find some ideal situation, but really the ideal was right within the order, and that it was up to him to give himself to that. The seriousness that he had about the spiritual life, how he was such a man of prayer and work and community, and yet so human and so much at the service of others, is something that all of us in formation have to learn, that we have to reserve the first place for God. We have to give serious attention to our spiritual lives, but that doesn't hurt us or stop us from also reaching out and helping our brothers and serving the people that we are assigned to take care of. So St. John of the Cross, a great, great example, well worth study and thought.
Well, John of the Cross, for me, he is not only father, but he is also someone that I look to in terms of prayer and contemplation. For me, John is a very passionate person. He's a passionate lover. He is a person who was so committed to deep prayer and love that I would like to be an imitator of that, if nothing else. I find John of the Cross a person of deep hope. In his writings on the Dark Night, which came about when he was imprisoned by his own brothers, he was at his darkest hour, and he was able to keep hope alive within himself by God's grace. And from that hope came love. And he surrendered himself so totally to what was happening to him that is a practice that I would love for myself, but also I would hope Carmelites to follow would also follow that. In terms of St. John of the Cross in formation, as I mentioned before, in his darkest hour he was able to write, and that's what I find helpful from his poetry. They are all hope-filled. He surrendered himself totally to God, and in that surrender God transformed him so that even though it was dark for him, even though he surrendered, he was still a loving person. And I think in terms of formation, it can get hard at times for friars, for nuns, in their own personal life, in their spiritual life, and they can look to John. He wrote in the spiritual canticle, where are you? Where have you gone? You have wounded me and left me. And that wounding we all feel within us. And in the darkness, he was able to give himself. In the darkness, it is my hope that we will be able to give ourselves, and in that time, also be transformed as he was.
John of the Cross has been a mentor for me since I was in high school. I had a spiritual director when I was a senior in high school, and he gave me John of the Cross's poetry to read. And really that poetry has stood by me over a lifetime and really began what was to turn out to be my life interest in spirituality. He has such passion in his work, and I think that passion has set on fire my own desire for God, really over a lifetime. I think we have to realize that from beginning to end, John of the Cross is always talking about desire, and he's always telling us how desire is educated over a lifetime. And this has influenced me. He tells how it's purified and how over a lifetime desire is transformed and finally fulfilled, really in union with God. Years ago, back in the early 80s, I wrote an article called Impasse and Dark Night, and that article has become somewhat of a classic around the country and even beyond. It's used in a lot of the theological schools, and it is an interpretation of John of the Cross's Dark Night, particularly the first book of the Dark Night. The reason I mention it here when I'm saying what kind of an influence has John of the Cross had in my life is because that article was written in one of the darkest times of my own life. I could have walked out of the community and never come back. And there's a way in which though it was certainly the fruit of my study and my research and areas that I was particularly interested in, nevertheless, looking back on it, I realized I was also processing my own darkness. And I've come to believe that that's one of the reasons the article was successful in a sense, is because it came out of my own heart and my own inner turmoil. But I have continued working on John of the Cross, as I said, since I was a novice, and I return to him over and over again. And of course I've given lots and lots of workshops on him. But he's very alive to me and very real. And I love to teach him, and I love to share him with others and help them to love him too, and to be guided by him. We spent, when our sisters, who are now all solemnly professed within the last 2 to 5 years, 5-6 years, we spent a year on John of the Cross in formation, studying. They have read every one of his major works, and if they never read them again thoroughly from cover to cover, they have read them once, and we've studied through them together. And maybe that will help me to say how I think that, how valuable maybe is the way to put it, how valuable I think the study of John of the Cross is for Carmelites, because John delineates the journey of desire, and he tells us how the Holy Spirit educates desire over a lifetime and helps it to move from a desire that is unfree, complicated, in a sense ungiven, to a desire that is free and is purified and is really transformed in a real mutuality and communion with God. Some of the things that I think are important when one talks about formation are, first of all, the priority that John gives to Jesus Christ. In the end of the first book of the Ascent, he says, have a habitual desire to imitate Christ. Now he means to be close to Christ, to have Christ for a companion, and learn what you can about his life and enter into his life in prayer. The point is, though, he is saying, other desires weaken, other desires distress us. It's when Christ is the priority in terms of our desire that we are sort of on the right track. But some of the other things that he tells us, I think they're important because he seems so demanding and in some cases so unsympathetic toward creation, or saying that creation has to be denied, meaning everything created. But on the other hand, in the first book of the Spiritual Canticle, he tells us how the experience of the self is really an experience of God. The experience of creation, this world is really an experience of God. And the experience of human beings, he differentiates between creation and human beings. The experience of human beings is other human persons is also an experience of God. And this is the prayer milieu in which we slowly discover Christ in all these places. And slowly, through these experiences, the Holy Spirit is etching within us the outline of Christ. So I think that's something really valuable in the beginning of the Spiritual Canticle. Another thing that I believe is so wonderful about his works is that he helps us to traverse and to interpret the dark passages that we make in our life of prayer and in our life, in our community life, in our life in this world. And he does this almost as no one else does. It's not that it isn't in the tradition before him, it is, but John of the Cross is able to really, really delineate this dark passage for us. So much so that even the Jesuits, who have developed such a way of doing the spiritual exercises that is so valuable for so many people, yet they do not really have a clear way to deal with darkness in prayer, as I have found out, and often have filled in for some of the Jesuit spiritual directors this piece of the spiritual life. So I think in our tradition we have something really, really valuable to help us to know when is the time to cling to God in darkness and in faith and in hope, and to teach us how to be silently open, attentive, surrendered to God at this time that John says is the beginning of contemplative prayer. But he teaches us how to enter truly into the silence of God and to learn that God is our being. God is our very being. John would say God is in the center of the soul. He would talk about it a little bit differently. And then beyond the darknesses, I think he tells us what the promise of contemplative prayer really is and what it would mean to be really transformed in love, to really experience the mutuality and communion that we can know with God, and to really understand how, in the end, our desires are really fulfilled, and how God eventually shows us our own beauty, how we see our own selves in the beauty of God, and how, differently from the beginning of our lives, we are helped to see that God is in all things. We finally find at the other end of things that not that we find God in all things, but that we find all things in God, which doesn't mean that that's all we have when desire is really fulfilled in that way, because John says the person finally finds delight in all heavenly and earthly things. He doesn't say just earthly, it's heavenly things, which is what you'd expect, but he says when the soul is transformed in love, she finds happiness in all earthly and heavenly things. So I think that to have held before us in formation the real promise of contemplative life, the living flame of love, as John would talk about it, that this can be given to us. This can be, we can long for this, and we can live our lives in the belief and in the hope that God wants to fulfill our deepest desires.
I think John of the Cross is important because John of the Cross offers full spectrum. I call it full spectrum spirituality. If you start with the precautions, or if you start with his sayings of light and love, each one is a self-contained, rather simple, rather easily applied maxim for life. Or you can move all the way to stanzas 11 through 27, let's say, of the spiritual canticle. Where this is nuptial bed stuff, this is inner mansion stuff, this is inner cavern stuff. It's advanced spirituality. So he has a lot to say to anybody at any stage in the path. Why he's important to guys in initial formation is simply that same reason. And besides, we can get caught up in, the day-to-day, whether it's the day-to-day of priesthood, the day-to-day of studenthood, the day-to-day of just life. Or you can get caught up in the stuff of the world, entertainment, comfort, status, all that. And he's constantly reminding us, calling us out of that into, real heavy-duty spiritual life. And why I think anybody would be a Carmelite today, it's got to be heavy-duty spirituality. There's nothing else going on out there that we offer that would offer more than the world offers. And it offers so much more. So that's my thought, is John of the Cross will bring us to something the world can't even begin to offer. Amen.
So the first question is, who is John of the Cross for me? And I would say that I've grown in my appreciation for who he is. And I'd say it's primarily two things. One is, I think he has written about and helped us to understand probably the key human experience. That is to say, what is the most basic human desire? And that is the desire for God. It's in some respects extraordinarily simple, but the history of humanity has been how we've made that much more complex than it needs to be. And so he has helped us to understand that bottom line, really, for any human being, is this desire for God. And the second thing is that he has shown us a method for pursuing that, and that is contemplative prayer. And my understanding of contemplative prayer is this encounter with God, ultimately without words, but that the process really is in this desire, this pursuit for God, we continually encounter all of that in me and in each one of us that resists that desire. So he's really been able to describe for us this ambivalence that we have, both this deep desire for God and then things in ourselves, our own personalities, our own histories that get in the way of being open to that desire. It has, I think, in some respects profoundly affected me, just in terms of my own, trying to keep focused in my life, in And so trying to be faithful to that desire and to be open to the resistance to it in myself by practicing contemplative prayer. And what does John offer to formation of younger Carmelites? I think he's a challenge because of language and really living in a different world philosophically and theologically. So I know in my own experience, it took me a long time to come to an appreciation for John of the Cross. So I think it's a challenge to present him in a way that's accessible to Carmelites who are newer in the life. I think we have a responsibility to do that with the understanding that he may be hard for people to understand. And it takes a lot of life experience, I think, to begin to see how profoundly insightful he was, and how helpful he was and is in kind of describing the human experience. So I'd say read John, but more importantly pray, and live one's life, and pray consistently, faithfully. Communal prayer is important, but really John is about the value of personal contemplative prayer. And I think we have to continue to invite our newer Carmelites to do that. I think it's their desire, and it's a challenge for all of us. But I think read him, but most importantly pray.
For me personally, John is a very influential figure. I'm not big on devotion to the saints in general. And even for the Carmelite saints, I think I have a much stronger bond with Teresa than I do with John. But I find that John's teaching is something that is really beginning to make sense to me personally as I mature more and more. And I think that the key thing for me and John is that ultimately there's only God. That all things are passing, and maybe my exposure to Buddhism over the years that's helped me to understand this, but just to realize that there's only God, and the only reality is God, and that, you know, this purity of heart that the gospel calls us to, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God, that this purity of heart means when we can center our heart only on God, when we can recognize that reality, that the only thing that matters is God. Now, I'm a long way from being there, but John really shows me that path. And he also shows me the path of transformation, which I think is so central, that all Christian spiritual life is about the transformation into Christ. John's whole thing in the ascent of Mount Carmel, that the lover transforms the beloved into himself, that, as Paul says in Galatians, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, it is Christ Jesus who lives in me. To realize all in me that has to die, all that I have to let go of, again, all that I have to be purified of that isn't God, so that God's grace can work this transformation in me. So I think I see John's, even though I'm more attracted, I think, to Teresa as a personality, I think it's John's teaching that really is marking out the spiritual path for this late section in my spiritual journey, that the clouds are sort of clearing and I see John's path is the path to follow. Now, as for how John can affect formation, or the role John should play in our formation, you know, when I went through formation many years ago, there was just nothing Carmelite specific, and that's really improved 100%. That, I should say, it's improved 1,000%. We've come a long way in really capturing more and more of our Carmelite heritage. but personally, I think our emphasis in formation is still far too much on ministry and not sufficiently enough on the personal development, on the spiritual growth, on the spiritual path. And John is a spiritual master. I really think that we need to do far more in-depth work on the doctrine of Teresa, the doctrine of John, and Therese and Elizabeth of the Trinity. I think we really, I think our guys are still, finally professed, out of initial formation, and still couldn't tell you very much about these people. And I think we really need to deepen the focus of what's specifically Carmelite in our formation by studying these great masters. And I think John is so important because, again, this whole idea of transformation. The Teresa, I think, is very good with the nitty-gritties of life. She's very good on the practical things. But it's John, I think, that gives us the theoretical structure and the sort of the theology of spiritual growth and maturity. So I think we really need to do far more in-depth work on these great spiritual masters, and not only in initial formation, but in the ongoing formation of the members of the Carmelite family as well.
Okay, thank you. Well,
You're
maybe
welcome.
I can have a third question that fits into the second one. If you had a concrete suggestion for a community like Whitefriars, not only focusing on John of the Cross, but in general on the Carmelite saints, how would you include them more in formation? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, I think maybe to pick a book a year. For example, maybe this year to do the ascent of Mount Carmel, and to divide it into 8 sections and monthly meet on them and talk about what we've read and what group discussion, maybe in small groups, but to process the material. Maybe this year the ascent of Mount Carmel, maybe next year Teresa's interior castle or way of perfection, maybe the following year to do Therese and Elizabeth of the Trinity together. But to something sort of like an in-house book club where we would really not just look at these books but discuss them.
So, who is John of the Cross for me? I've always thought of him primarily as a little guy. We know that he was small physically. As a matter of fact, Teresa joked around that he was only half a friar, but she had great respect for him because of his interior spiritual life. John was one of those people who, in many ways, was a gigantic force from the point of view of being a spiritual writer. But he never thought of himself as any more than just a humble friar, someone who was trying to live his life, do his work, write down insights that he thought. But he was actually a very busy person. That's something that we tend to forget about. John was always at work trying to direct sisters. He was always doing sacramental ministry to people in whatever area he lived in, and someone who is very easy for the rest of us to imitate in staying busy, but still allowing the depth of his spiritual life to be able to influence what and how he did his ministry. Most of the writings that we remember John for were done at some very specific times of his life. Patrick is fond of pointing to the time when John was locked up in prison. Patrick refers to that as his sabbatical, a time when he couldn't do any ministerial work, so he was forced back on to reflect on his poetry and trying to explain what that meant. So the times of writing and really deep thought were rather rare. Most of the time, John was refreshingly like the rest of us. Second question? What is John of the Cross for our ministry today, our formation? I think the number one thing that I would recommend in the formation world is that we shouldn't be afraid of John. He was certainly one of those who soared the heavens. His poetry and his commentary on the spiritual life are very lofty. But John never thought of himself as a great, important person. John really hated the politics that went through the Discalced Reform and the fighting between some of the other members of the order. He really wanted nothing to do with power. He didn't want to be the provincial. He didn't want to be anyone of significance except for a good friar. And whatever we can gain from his writing it's frosting on the cake. But I think the cake itself, which is, of course, the central part of our lesson, it consists in just living a good religious life in a very ordinary way, maintaining humility, never considering ourselves to be terribly important, terribly brilliant. In other words, if we just kind of shrink into the background and disappear, that's what John wanted to do most of the time. So I think that's a very good lesson for those of us who might be inclined to push ourselves forward.
Juan de la Cruz es una de las personas a las que he llegado a apreciar y admirar mucho, especialmente durante los últimos años viviendo aquí en Washington, por dos simples razones, ¿no? Aquí tuve la posibilidad de tomar clases con Padre Patrick y esto fue un tiempo de leer, meditar y tomarlo parte también de mi oración. Estas lecturas formaron parte de mi oración y me ayudó un poco a profundizar más mi vida espiritual y cómo puedo entender el sentido de oración de acuerdo a Juan de la Cruz. La otra razón es que durante mis 30 días de retiro tuve la posibilidad de leer a San Juan de la Cruz con Teresa de Ávila. Y durante ese tiempo fue un tiempo de meditación, de reflexión con la lectura de San Juan de la Cruz, aunque esto no era parte de nuestro retiro espiritual, pero fue parte de mi propia iniciativa. Por tanto, después de todas estas meditaciones y lecturas, puedo decir que San Juan de la Cruz nos ha mostrado una manera de ser cristiano, una forma de ser carmelita, de acuerdo a nuestra espiritualidad. Por tanto, respondiendo a la pregunta, ¿cómo San Juan de la Cruz nos puede ayudar en nuestra formación? Voy a decir tres cosas de las que al menos para mí son muy importantes y que me ayudan en mi vida diaria, ¿no? En mi oración personal, en mi vida diaria y en mi deseo por la búsqueda de Dios, ¿no? La primera cosa es San Juan de la Cruz habla acerca de los ídolos, ¿no? Los ídolos, especialmente en la subida al Monte Carmelo, ¿no? Y yo relaciono los ídolos con las cosas que tenemos que luchar día a día, cosas de la vida cotidiana que de una y otra manera nos alejan de la presencia de Dios. Pero hay algo muy particular cuando San Juan de la Cruz habla de los ídolos, ¿no? ¿Qué es un ídolo, por ejemplo, ¿no? Algo que nosotros nos creamos y que al final reemplaza, ¿no?, el lugar de Dios. Algo que puede ser bueno, pero que al final termina reemplazando el lugar de Dios en nuestra vida, ¿no? Entonces San Juan de la Cruz nos ayuda a ser conscientes, ¿no?, de que en cualquier momento podemos caer en eso, pero al mismo tiempo nos enseña de que en el proceso de nuestra vida espiritual nosotros necesitamos de la gracia de Dios para liberarnos de estos ídolos que al final nos impiden esta relación con Dios. La siguiente idea es acerca del deseo de la búsqueda de Dios, ¿no? El deseo, ese anhelo de la búsqueda de Dios es lo que al final nos ayuda en nuestra vida cotidiana a enfocarnos, ¿no? en esta búsqueda de Dios que al final nos lleva a esa unión perfecta de amor con la que habla San Juan de la Cruz, ¿no? Nuestros deseos llegan a ser los deseos de Dios, o nuestros deseos por aquello que no es Dios no se convierten en deseos que nos ayudan en nuestra búsqueda de Dios, pero que eso es algo esencial en nuestra formación. Y finalmente la oración, ¿no? Veo algo clave. Dios habla en la oración, y la oración como carmelitas es donde nosotros buscamos a Dios, ¿no? Es ahí donde Dios nos habla al corazón, donde nosotros nos encontramos con Dios, y creo que como carmelitas tenemos que rezar, ¿no? No hay otra forma de buscar a Dios sino a través de la oración.